Thank you, Beth. Good day to this day of welcome and worship and internet community. We welcome you to the worship at Hively Mennonite Church. I'd like to highlight two announcements: that there will be no snacks and scripture this Sunday, and that Hively members are encouraged to look into and sign up for the Cultivate Service Project. Feeding hungry people is always a wonderful and worthwhile gift we can give to people, and in the economic stresses that we are dealing with due to COVID, these needs are greater than ever. So please consider participating in this project. So thank you for being here. We continue to have different ways of bringing in our offering, and so if you would please be mindful and intentional about your contribution to the work of this congregation, that would be appreciated. If you will join me now in our call to worship. Come, let us worship. Ponder with me, if you will, the finely woven and veined wing of a butterfly. The ability to extend the fingers of your hand and then fold them into your palm. A field of wildflowers bursting with colors. The setting sun as the wind rolls over a field of grasses on a Kansas prairie. Or the intricacies of math. This is the handiwork of the creating, loving God we worship. This is the handiwork of the same God who created a new way through Jesus to teach us more about God's love. So come, let us worship and adore, praise and listen. Let us come into the presence of the Most High creating God. You'll join me in a prayer. You who knit us in our mother's wombs, you who created us alongside all the rest of your glorious and beautiful creation, ask that we worship and adore you. And so here we are. Guide our prayers, our thoughts, our hopes, and the moments of our time this day in worship. We will sing now, What is This Place? Verses 1, 2, and 4. It is our tradition to light a candle each Sunday to remind us of our witness as peacemakers and peacekeepers. Jamie Pitts has written the meditation for this Sunday. The Uruguayan Jesuit theologian Juan Luis Segundo wrote a lengthy theological work in the 1970s whose English title was A Theology for Artisans of the New Humanity. In this series of books, Segundo begins to reinterpret core Christian convictions in light of his view that God liberates the oppressed. The title suggests that joining in God's work of liberation, joining in the work of the church, is fundamentally an artistic task. What does it mean for us to partner with God in the creative act of liberation? The passage Jake will preach on from Exodus indicates that the creative work of an artist takes a lot of planning and a lot of hard work. That suggestion seems to be confirmed when we take a look around our world. This past week, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia, a winner of the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize, took his country to the brink of civil war. Anger at corruption and injustice in Peru has caused the downfall of 2 presidents there in the past week. In the United States, the president seemingly rejects the results of our recent election. All of this is taking place in the midst of a pandemic and the growing climate crisis. It wasn't enough for Prime Minister Ahmed to end one war. It wasn't enough for one president to fall in Peru. It wasn't enough to vote against authoritarian rule in the United States. What does it mean for us to be artisans of the new humanity? It means allowing God to spark our creative imaginations for a different way of life. It means allowing God to direct us in the detailed planning work we must do. It means allowing God to sustain us in the long, difficult work that lies ahead. May it be so. Will you join me in the litany of the peace candle? God of peace, Christ of peace, Spirit of peace, you are calling us to be peacemakers. Today we light this candle as a reminder of our calling. Will you join me now in a time of confession and assurance? Lord Jesus, blind we are, do thou enlighten us. Naked we are, do thou clothe us. Wounded, do thou heal us. Dead, do thou quicken us. We know of no light, no physician, no life, except thee. Because of God's great love for you and God's great mercy for all, you are forgiven. We will live as those who are truly loved and truly forgiven through the gift of God's grace. This week's sermon text comes from Exodus 35, verses 30 through 35. Jake will be reading the Spanish translation and then will be preaching. Then Moses said to the Israelites, "See, the Lord has called by name Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. He has filled him with divine spirit, with skill, intelligence, and knowledge of every kind of craft, to devise artistic designs, to work in gold, silver, and bronze, in cutting stones for setting, in carving wood, in every kind of craft. And he has inspired him to teach, both him and Oholiab, son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan. He has filled them with skill to do every kind of work done by an artisan, or by a designer, or by an embroiderer in blue, purple, and crimson yarns, and in fine linen, or by a weaver, by any sort of artisan or skilled designer." Jake, we await your words.
En español, leo del libro de Éxodo, capítulo 35, versículos 30 hasta 35. Dice, Moisés les dijo a los israelitas, tomen en cuenta que el Señor ha escogido expresamente a Bezalel, hijo de Uri y nieto de Hur, de la tribu de Judá, y lo ha llenado del Espíritu de Dios, de sabiduría, inteligencia y capacidad creativa, para hacer trabajos artísticos en oro, plata y bronce, para cortar y engastar piedras preciosas, para hacer tallados en madera y realizar toda clase de diseños artísticos y artesanías. Dios les ha dado a él y a Oholiab, hijo de Ahisamach, de la tribu de Dan, la habilidad de enseñar a otros. Los ha llenado de gran sabiduría para realizar toda clase de artesanías, diseños y recamados en lana, púrpura, carmesí y escarlata y lino. Son expertos tejedores y hábiles artesanos en toda clase de labores y diseños. La palabra del Señor, gracias a Dios. Being from Colorado, we have a certain kind of self-image that I think others maybe have of us too, that we're sort of known for our most prominent feature out there, the Rocky Mountains. We're known for our 58 14ers, as we call them. These are 14,000 peaks, 14,000-foot peaks plus. We have 58 of them in Colorado, more than any other state in the United States. Not to brag, but just listing some facts. You can see them. It's the first thing you see when you arrive at DIA, Denver International Airport. You come in and you look westward and you can see this sprawling mountain range, this backbone of Colorado off to the west, and it is just gorgeous. But what we don't often talk about, and folks don't often realize, is that if you're at that same airport at DIA, and instead of turning westward, you turned eastward, you could pretty much wave to Iowa, all the way across the Great Plains. Yes, it is our dirty little secret in Colorado that actually 1/3 of our state is virtually indistinguishable from Kansas and Nebraska. Not that those are bad places, it's just very flat compared to the middle of our state. It's not what comes to mind when you hear of Colorado. And I feel like in reading Exodus, that Exodus, the book, is a little bit like this too. When you think of Exodus, you think of threats of infanticide, you think of slavery and burning bushes and magic and miracles and plagues and parted waters, and it reads like this page-turning comic book or blockbuster script until you keep reading. And the last third of Exodus reads more like a tedious instruction manual, because it literally is a tedious instruction manual at the end of Exodus. It's full of sleep-inducing details about dimensions and measurements, tables and lampstands, boxes, breastplates, and veils. It's like driving from the Rockies into eastern Colorado There are some gems of beauty out there, no doubt, but you just need a little bit of caffeine probably to help you make it through the drive. We'll call this terrain Eastern Exodus, maybe. And Eastern Exodus has some tiresome topography to it. But if we stick with it, and if we don't get bogged down by the tedious details, and if we don't focus on each individual stalk of corn or wheat, as it were, each detail of the passage, we see instead this broader, more beautiful picture. And we notice, rather, as the song states, these amber waves of grain. There's this wind blowing through the fields of Eastern Exodus, and it's whispering something. What is it whispering? Where is it coming from? Where is it going? One of the first things it whispers to us is that this passage, or these passages rather, are not a parenthesis. These passages about the tabernacle are not a parenthesis. They're not an intermission during the otherwise exciting narrative of Exodus, but rather they're the culmination of everything that had come before and everything that is going to come after, a visible sign of all that is to come. If we could put it in short, we could say it this way, that the culmination of Exodus, though our theme throughout this study has been liberation, but the culmination of Exodus is not liberation, but rather is adoration. Early on in Exodus, we might remember that God instructed Moses to tell Pharaoh, yes, let my people go, but there was more to it. It was let my people go so that they may go and make offerings and that they may go praise and worship. There was something that they were being saved from, but there was something that they were also being saved for. Liberation itself wasn't the end goal as such, because as we saw in so many of these texts in the middle of the book after their liberation, the Israelites struggled immediately and immensely even after they experienced their liberation from bondage. Liberation was the prelude, but the chorus was to be adoration and worship of Yahweh, of God, this God that they were getting to know. I stated a few weeks ago a little bit about this catechism that part of the church, more the Reformed tradition, has used in their teaching over the years. It's called the Westminster Shorter Catechism, and the question that it asks has to do with our ultimate purpose as human beings. And it says this is the first question that it asks: what is the chief end of humanity? And the answer is that the chief end of humanity is to glorify God and to enjoy God forever. Going along these lines, we can say that salvation and liberation, very two similar terms in Scripture, often interchangeable. Salvation and liberation in Christian thought is never our chief end as humanity. And so we're often right to criticize ecclesiologies or churches where salvation is sort of talked about as this end-all. When were you saved? Are you saved? And we all bristle a little bit at that in our context. We know a little bit of that, those of us that grew up in more conservative contexts, as if the idea of salvation was everything, and then after that, it's sort of just vague waiting until you get to heaven. That's too truncated a view of what God is doing in Scripture. But on the other side, and this is kind of more in our territory, we're also right because of this passage to criticize any ecclesiology or church understanding that's based solely on liberation. Because we saw that even when the Israelites were physically liberated from Egypt, they still were struggling and still wrestling to come to terms with who they were in God and what they were to be in the world. So liberation, too, is also a truncated term to understand all of what God is doing. And so in our context, we could say that even equality as such, and even racial justice as such, and even peace as such are not the chorus, but rather the prelude. They're like the place settings for the meal, the feast, which is the praise and enjoyment of God's presence and God's beauty. And to stop short of that is like to basically stop in the doorway, to stop in the threshold and marvel at the trim work of the doorway, but forget to fully enter into the expansive throne room of God's immeasurable beauty with all creation, with all brothers and sisters. For this we were created. The French philosopher and mystic Simone Weil said this: about worship and about idolatry, as Tim spoke about a few weeks ago. She said, one has only the choice between God and idolatry. There's no other possibility, she says. For the faculty of worship is in us. It's in here. It's what we do. It's what we are called to do. So she says it's either directed somewhere into this world or into another. We have only the choice between God and idolatry. So it shouldn't be coincidental to see that in between the liberation and this section in Exodus of adoration of God in the tabernacle is a little clip of an episode of the golden calf. Because in between liberation and adoration, there was this yearning to worship, as Simone Weil pointed out. There's this yearning to worship, and it has to be pointed somewhere. And so we only have the choice between God and idolatry. St. Augustine, in his Confessions, basically wrestled with this his whole juvenile life, searching for something more to fill him. Academic pursuits and relationships within the academic environment to build his way up into the hierarchy of society. He struggled with all of this, and he tasted all of it, and he was climbing the ladder until he realized that these were all vain pursuits. And so he says this famously in his Confessions, "For thyself thou hast made us, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." Speaking of God. Late have I loved thee. It took me a while, he's saying. Late have I loved thee, thou beauty, ever old and ever new. It's a beautiful reflection. But let's be honest. Doesn't it sound a little bit boring to envision our main goal as the worship and enjoyment of God? At least if we kind of envision it in our childhood notions of heaven, floating on clouds in disembodied, ethereal, wispy forms, playing harps and singing. I don't know why it's always harps, but for some reason we're always playing harps in heaven. And doing this forever and ever and ever. And it doesn't help this notion that here in Exodus, where worshiping God takes center stage, it comes to us in the land of Eastern Exodus, right? And feels like driving maybe through Nebraska or just flatlands that don't have a lot of scenery other than the corn stalks, which is a beauty of its own for all that love Nebraska. I'll say that. But it's hard to envision it as something other than bland and boring and dreary. I came across this too in my time when I was working in a program called Reading for Life at Center for Community Justice that I've shared about before. And it was basically a youth mentoring program based around reading adult or teen novels together and then teaching the teens beforehand a little bit about what's called virtue theory, like from Aristotle and the ancient Greeks, this idea that you can't live a good life unless you are living into the virtues and becoming more virtuous people, becoming more courageous and becoming more selfless and becoming more just. Like without these things, we cannot live the good life. And that these virtues were kind of a balance between two extremes. Courage is the balance between cowardice and being foolhardy. And to be temperate or to show self-control is the balance between excess or gluttony and deprivation. So there's this balance in the middle. They had this vision of a beautiful balance. They called it the golden mean. And when we were talking about this one day, about people or learning to live lives that kind of navigate this balance between excess and deprivation, and talking about people that are able to do that and what that's like, I will never forget one of the students made the observation. He was a really, really bright kid, really sharp. I was super impressed with him. And his response to it was, yeah, but people like that are really boring. Like that was his vision of this kind of a life. And we sort of have this idea. But again, I love what Simone Weil, the mystic and philosopher, says. She says, imaginary evil is romantic and varied. She says, but real evil is gloomy and monotonous and barren. We could maybe ask somebody who's been drawn into and sucked into any sort of addiction. Real evil is gloomy and monotonous and barren and boring. But then she says, imaginary good is boring, sometimes our conception of it, but real good is always new and marvelous and intoxicating. Wow. Adoration, then, if we can take Veal's word, adoration is not monotonous stagnation, but adoration is actually active co-creation with God. Because in this text, there are actually two parts to it. In chapters 25 to 30, and then in chapters 35 to 40, it first has the vision of the plan or the dream of God that is supposed to take place among the people, this tabernacle. And then there's the actual creation, or like putting it into place, people actually building it and following the instructions, which is why the end of Exodus is so tedious, because it has 5 chapters of basically the exact same thing. The commentaries don't even reiterate what happens later on. They just say, just go read what I wrote for the first 5 chapters. It's the same thing. So it reiterates the same thing, but it's interesting that there's 2 sections. One is the vision. One is the execution, or the bringing about, the realization of this vision. It's like there's something invisible in the heavenlies that's to be made visible in the earthly. Like the holy transcendent one, the one outside of time and space, is supposed to become present and imminent, literally in our midst. The tabernacle was to be in the midst of the people, not just on a mountainside where the gods of the ancient Near East most often were, but rather in the midst of the people. We hear this reiterated in the New Testament when the disciples asked Jesus, Lord, teach us to pray. How do we pray to God? What should we do? What should we say? And Jesus basically says this, a reiteration of Eastern Exodus, right? He says, Our Father who art in heaven, holy is your name. This is what the tabernacle was, God's holiness in our midst. Holy is your name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The transcendent brought near. May things be here like they are in the heavenlies where God is reigning. So in our text, this comes about, and this is the amazing part, this comes about, this on earth as it is in heaven, when God's Spirit fills individuals like Bezalel and Aholiab, fills them to be creative and to bring God's invisible reign into their visible midst. This isn't a stagnant process. It's active and creative inspiration. Like God breathed into humans in the beginning, but it wasn't just life, but also purpose. God breathes in us purpose. Humans are entrusted and empowered with God's creative work to bring God's beauty into physical form in the creation. And we are endowed with that artistic creativity, with, you could call it purposeful artistic creativity. Purposeful in that the artistic skill that is true, and I think we could call God-honoring and Christian, is artistic skill that further beautifies creation by ultimately making God's presence even more tangible and visible. That's the true sign of true artwork, I think, is when our skill beautifies creation in such a way that it makes God's presence more real and more tangible in our midst. Have you ever felt that or experienced that? I know I have, in a variety of ways, through movies, through literature. I can remember first reading, really getting into some good poetry and encountering poets who just really saw the world. Like you read their words, words like Mary Oliver's and Annie Dillard's, and it felt like you were encountering someone who was really awake and like you'd been asleep your whole life and you hadn't seen anything yet. And their artistic beauty of their words opens you up to the world around you, and it beckons you to look at it and to see God around you. I like how Mary Oliver describes it in one of her poems. The beginning of her collection of poems in Thirst starts off saying, "My work is loving the world. This is her work, her creative work. My work is loving the world. Here, the sunflower, there, the hummingbird, equal seekers of sweetness. Here, the blue plums, there, the quickening yeast. Here, the speckled clam dug down in the sand. And then she gets a little distracted and she says, are my boots old? Is my coat torn? But then she rallies and says, no, let me focus on my work, which is loving the world, which is mostly standing still and learning to be amazed. Wow. It's people like that that awaken you to the beauty of God around you. I'm so thankful to be a part of a congregation of artists. You can see it behind me today. We are a congregation of photographers and a congregation of writers and quilters and musicians and literal painters, and it just goes on and on and on. People who make YouTube channels and teach psychology. Will's got his own YouTube channel and teaches people psychology through looking at modern media and modern films. Like, we are a congregation of artists. And I'm so blessed to see that. I found it striking the other day how on our Zoom time, Annie Moore, reflecting on her quilting, confessed, I think, the confession of all artists, or all people in general, but especially us in our art, that in her quilting, sometimes she's more interested in people seeing it and sort of praising her sort of artistic giftedness. I think that is the ultimate temptation of everybody who's ever written, everybody who's ever taken a photo, everybody who's ever played music, everybody who's ever made something with wood. Like, you want people to see it and to think, wow, they're gifted. We struggle with that, I think, even at this pulpit. That is, I think, the temptation of every artist. Whatever you do, it says, Paul says, whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, do it all to the glory of God. And so we can always distinguish between when our art is starting to become something that is about us versus about God by what it produces in us and what it produces in others. Because if it's the Spirit of God that fills us and gives us the ability to produce art in all of its forms, then that same Spirit is going to produce through that artwork, I think, the fruit that that Spirit brings, which is love and joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And so if your artwork is getting to a point where it's not producing that fruit in you or in others that encounter your art, then maybe we can reflect at times, as Annie so candidly did for all of us, and say, maybe I'm making this more about me than I am about God. Maybe it's not bringing in God's beauty, but it's trying to insert myself. And that is really hard not to do. But it is most beautiful when we can say, glory to God in this. I think of, in particular, Eric Liddell's, that famous runner depicted in Chariots of Fire. Most people are familiar with that. Beth even learned the Chariots of Fire song not too long ago to play during our children's time when I shared about him. But people are familiar with his story. Basically, he was an Olympic runner, very strong Christian convictions. And he made the comment, the statement that when he runs, he feels God's pleasure. I think that's what we should all be able to say in any sort of giftedness or any sort of artistic form that God has given us. When we do this, when I write or when I play music or when I'm working with wood or when I am quilting, I feel God's pleasure. And he showed this, though. It wasn't just that he was a good runner and he ran a lot and he had this inner sense of God's pleasure, but that conviction that God was the center of all things in his life made him choose to not run on Sundays, even though some of the Olympic trials, I think, were held on Sundays. And so he sort of recused himself from those races to his detriment. And that was a vision or a depiction of God's beauty in the world, the pleasure of God in his running, and yet his willingness to make God prime above that. I'm so thankful to be part of a congregation that creates things like this quilt behind me, this blending of artists who know how to quilt, like Terry and Annie and Elaine and those who started this project. But then I think of some of our younger ladies like Elia and Lindsay and Brenna and Krista, who are here participating as well. And they learned these skills from the older ladies. Because one of the things that the Spirit of God does when God fills us to create art is it says that he also filled them to teach to others these gifts. And so we see this sort of passing on, this teaching of the gifts, even in the artwork presented behind me today. What a beautiful depiction of God's creative spirit work in us, passed on. So in conclusion, I think some of the main lessons, and so much could be said about these passages, so interesting how these fit into the larger scope of Scripture. But I think the main lesson that we get from Eastern Exodus is the same message that we get from Scripture beginning to end, and that is this: that God is not content to simply be approached on a mountaintop, but God desires to be near God's people, walking with us in the garden as it was depicted in the beginning, present in the tabernacle as it's depicted in Exodus. And now as we're nearing Advent, we're finishing our Exodus series, we're coming into Advent, God present with us in Emmanuel, literally meaning God with us. John chapter 1, verse 1, and then in verse 14, we remember it says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then in verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. But the Greek, as I've understood it, I don't know Greek. Somehow I got through seminary without having to take Greek. As I've understood it, literally means, and the Word became flesh and tented or tabernacled among us. Jesus is the living tabernacle of God. God as living art among us in our midst, through whom all things were created. Jesus is where God's beauty and God's presence is more visible than ever. And so when we claim to be followers of Jesus, what we're saying is that we are being apprentices of God's creative beauty. And we can even say that true discipleship, true following after Jesus, is an art. It's to bring beauty into the world. May it be so. May your artwork bring the beauty of God into the world. Amen.
Our response hymn today is Hymnal Worship Book 311, The Church's One Foundation. We will sing verses 1, 4, and 5.
Amen.
Let us pray. God, you are the beauty ever old and ever new. May our hearts never yield to the temptation to think that your goodness is something stagnant and monotonous. But may we know that your beauty is ever new, and there's more depths to you than we could ever know. We could never explore the end of this world or the end of this cosmos, because there's so much beauty to behold. May our lives be filled with your Spirit, God, bringing your beauty, your light, and your life, and your liberation into this world and into our relationships. May people see new creation in the places where we step, in the places where we congregate, in the places where we worship. May that new creation be a visible sign of your presence and your dwelling near to us. Amen. So go, be co-creators with God, and bring the beauty and the majesty and the glory of God further into this world through the hands and the minds that God has given you. May the world see God's beauty in and through you and glorify God because of it. Amen. Go in peace.